10,000 years ago, the world was unrecognizable. There were no cities, no kings, no armies, and no written words. Humanity lived in fragile tribes, bound only by survival and the hunt. Nights were lit only by fire, and each dawn was a question of life or death. This was a time when the earth ruled us, not the other way around. Yet, in those forgotten centuries, something began to stir. A shift so powerful it would change everything forever. The first seeds of civilization were planted, but with them came hunger, inequality, and war. The question is, did civilization save us or curse us? Life in 10,000 BCE was fragile, but it was also raw and unfiltered. Humanity lived scattered across vast plains, dense forests, and winding rivers. There were no borders to mark territory, no kingdoms to enforce laws, and no cities to hide within. The world itself was the only ruler. Each clan was small, often no more than a few dozen men, women, and children. They carried little, for everything they owned could be slung across a shoulder or strapped to a back. Their homes were temporary shelters of wood, hide, and stone. They followed the rhythm of the seasons, moving with migrating animals, chasing rivers when they dried, and climbing high ground when floods came. Every sunrise was uncertain. A successful hunt meant life. A failed one meant hunger gnawed at the belly for days. Men tracked game across miles of wilderness, reading the faintest signs in the dirt. Women gathered roots, fruits, and herbs, their knowledge of plants often making the difference between healing and poison. Children grew up fast, learning to weave nets, sharpen flint, and tend fire before they even knew the meaning of fear. Fire itself was sacred. It was warmth in the night, protection from beasts, and the heart of every camp. Around it, elders told stories, myths of spirits in the rivers, gods in the sky, and ancestors who whispered from the wind. These stories were not written down. They lived only in voices and memory, fragile threads passed from one generation to the next. To lose them was to lose a piece of identity forever. Death was always close. Sometimes it came from a predator, a sudden strike of claws in the dark. Other times it came slowly, through sickness that no herb could cure. Burials were simple, yet deeply spiritual. Bodies were laid in shallow earth, covered in red ochre, or surrounded by tools and trinkets to guide them into whatever lay beyond. Even in these early days, humans clung to belief that life did not simply end, that there was something greater waiting after the final breath. But survival was not only about death, it was also about connection. Clans relied on trust, for one betrayal could mean ruin. A hunter who kept food for himself would starve his brothers. A guard who slept while others rested could doom the entire tribe. Bonds of loyalty were the glue that kept them alive. Yet beneath this unity, the first cracks of conflict began to form. As populations slowly grew, groups started clashing over land and game. A river valley that once fed one tribe could not always feed two. Hunters who crossed into another's territory risked their lives. Raids broke out. Stones, spears, and fire became the first weapons of war. For the first time, blood was spilled, not for animals, but for control over people. Even in peace, survival pushed them toward change. Some tribes began to notice that scattered seeds near their camps grew into food months later. The idea of farming, simple, almost accidental, was born. Others began taming animals, learning that a goat could give milk, a dog could guard, and a sheep could provide more than one meal. These discoveries were small, but they cracked open the door to something larger. The old way of life was slipping. Nomads who had once wandered freely now lingered in valleys longer than before, drawn by the promise of steady harvests. Shelters that were once temporary grew heavier, stronger, less likely to be abandoned. The very earth seemed to pull humanity toward staying in one place. Yet with this shift came unease. Farming meant food, but also labor. Staying meant stability, but also vulnerability. Tribes who settled could be attacked, their crops stolen, their homes burned. Power was no longer about speed or skill alone. It was about how much land one could hold and how many people could defend it. To the clans still wandering, those who stayed seemed trapped. To those who stayed, the wanderers seemed doomed. But neither could see that both paths led to something greater and darker than either could imagine. For out of these first choices, civilization itself was being born. And with civilization came inequality, war, and control. The decision to stay changed everything. For thousands of years, humans had been wanderers, moving with the seasons, guided by rivers, stars, and game. But once seeds were planted, people began to tie themselves to the soil. Grain became treasure. Fields became lifelines. And suddenly, for the first time, there was something worth fighting over. The first farmers did not imagine the consequences. At first, it felt like security. A store of grain meant food for the winter. Herds of sheep and goats meant milk, wool, and meat. But storage created temptation. When food could be taken, hoarded, or guarded, power was born. And with power came division. Inequality entered human life silently. Some had more food than others. Some controlled fertile valleys, while others struggled on barren ground. Those who worked hardest were not always those who ate the most. The strongest, the cleverest, or simply the most ruthless began to rise above the rest. Leaders were no longer chosen only by courage in the hunt or wisdom by the fire. They were chosen by control over food, land, and people. Clans became tribes, and tribes began to fracture. The bonds of trust that once bound everyone equally began to bend under the weight of new rules. Men were ordered to tend fields rather than hunt. Women, once gatherers and healers, were pushed into roles that served farming and childbirth. Children became laborers. Freedom narrowed, replaced by walls of mud and stone. The old nomads looked at this with suspicion. To them, the settlers seemed trapped, chained to endless toil, their lives dictated by the rise and fall of crops. They had traded the dangers of the wild for the slavery of the soil. But to the settlers, the wanderers seemed weak, vulnerable, forever at the mercy of nature. Neither saw that both paths were pulling humanity toward a collision. Conflict soon followed. A field of wheat could be burned in an instant. A herd could be stolen overnight. A storehouse of grain was worth more than gold. Raids turned into battles. For the first time, humans killed not only for survival, but for conquest. The earliest wars were not fought over nations or borders. They were fought over food. With war came innovation. Spears became sharper, bows stronger, and blades forged with care. Walls were built around settlements to keep raiders out. Ditches were dug, towers raised, and fires burned on hilltops as warnings. The world was becoming harsher, more organized, more violent. And within this violence, injustice grew. Those who owned land commanded those who did not. Farmers were forced into servitude. Captives from raids were made slaves. Power no longer flowed equally within the tribe. It was concentrated in the hands of the few. Rituals also changed. Where once stories were shared freely around the fire, now they were bent into tools of control. Leaders claimed that gods favored them, that spirits had chosen them to rule. Fear and faith, once sources of unity, became weapons. The first seeds of organized religion and kingship were sown in this soil. For the people living in these times, the shift was almost invisible. Change moved slowly, across generations. A child born into farming knew nothing else. A slave taken from a raid never returned to freedom. A warrior who defended walls never imagined a life without them. But through these lives, civilization was beginning to take form. And yet, for all the progress, there was a price. Freedom was shrinking. The wild world that had once stretched without limits was now divided by borders, by fields, by ownership. Humans were no longer just surviving, they were dominating. But in doing so, they had unleashed something darker: greed, oppression, and endless conflict. The people of 10,000 BCE did not know they were shaping history. They did not know that their small decisions, where to plant, who to obey, who to conquer, would echo for thousands of years. To them, it was only survival. But in reality, it was the birth of something unstoppable. The world was no longer a wilderness of scattered tribes. It was becoming a battlefield of power. And from this battlefield, the first cities were waiting to rise. Yet one question lingered. If civilization was being born from blood and hunger, what kind of future would it create?